That's what it is.
Good morning. Whoa.
Whoa.
Now, get my audio visual technician up there, get us all tuned in. She's going, how do you run this thing? I have no idea. Is that better?
Yes.
Got the echo out?
See, she did a good job.
She's good. She can do anything.
Yeah, right.
You working on a combine?
I wish.
Does she do windows?
Yeah, she does do windows. I've seen that. Yeah. But if you need your combine worked on, you're going to need to go to Tabitha. She's the expert. Yeah, we give her lots of practice around our place. Let's see. I think it's been a week since we were together last. It seems like forever. 2 or 3 weeks in one. Last few days for sure. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, we are in 1 Kings chapter 16. And we're in a really interesting phase here as we begin this passage. Because it's following the northern kingdom, the land of Israel. And we've been through that rapid-fire succession of kings this last couple of times we've been talking about them. And one of the really interesting things about this passage, we kind of start a whole, I don't know what you want to call it, time period from here clear into 2 Kings about chapter 10, in which the whole of both Judah and Israel are going to be largely dictated by what happens, what's going on in Israel. The driving factor in the nation shifts from being Jerusalem to being driven by the northern kingdom. And you'll even see that as the southern kings, the kings of Judah, are even pulled into joint operations with the northern kingdom. And so a lot of what happens in the south is being directed and steered by what's going on in the north. And so it's kind of funny as you read this, and you can go to Chronicles and it follows through the kings of Judah, just boom, 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 boom. And it's not always, you don't always pick up that the most significant things that were happening were probably driven out of the north. And the strangest thing here is that, and because of the focus of the writer and what he was trying to put emphasis on and wanted you to see, this guy that we picked up last time called Omri, he's rules for 12 years, which for us would be a long time because our presidents at most rule 2 terms, and so it's 8 years. That's just eternity for the United States, you know, as far as a leader. Depending on which side of the leader you're on, it may seem longer than the other, you know. If your guy's in there, it's too short. If it's the other guy, it's way too, you know, this is how it works. Anyway, so it's all in how your perspective looks at it. But this guy's only in there 12 years up against those who are in there for 20 and 30 and, you know, 40 years. This is a fairly short period of time. And yet when you go to external evidence and look at archaeological things and stuff, which I don't know if we're going to be able to make it work. Rats. I started to get some pictures and stuff together, and I found this great website, and I asked Kathy, hey, can we just pull that up? And our thingy isn't talking to it itself up there. So unless somebody can lay hands upon our internet connection, we aren't going to be able to do that. But next time, we'll pull some of those up. Or you can go home, if you got your pencil handy there, you can write down all lowercase letters, theevidence.org.uk. And if you go in there to that website, www.theevidence.org, and make sure you put the UK in there, United Kingdom, because if you go to just .org, you'll get something totally different. It's probably a wonderful Christian website or something, but it's not this one. But they will give you historical, scientific, you know, different evidences for things in the scriptures. And if you go over and find their tab that says archaeology on it and follow that through, they will give you a little chart in there. First they'll give you a map of the area, modern day, with this area, the cities and things on it so you can see where it's located. And then you can go down to a chart, and it gives you a chart similar to one we have with the kings and all that, and then links on the right-hand side that will take you to actual photographs of some of the archaeological finds that are connected to these various kings. So it's kind of a cool website to look at. You can check it out yourself, or if we can make this thing work for next time, we'll bring it next time, take a look at some of those deals. But there are evidences for this reign that begins with a guy named Omri. And just to back ourselves up a little bit, we probably ought to look at it. We've got this land of Samaria. Again, this is much more modern day. This is New Testament map here, but it gives you an idea of the area that became Samaria in the New Testament is driven from this guy Omri, because he's the one that started it. And Samaria is right there. You can see it's up kind of central, northern, and it's a mountainous area. Might pop up, be a good time to pop up some pictures of the area. You can see that Samaria is in the center of like a bowl that's surrounded by some really rugged terrain. And I think one of my authors says it's about 2 hours across. Here is the hill of Samar, and which Samaria is named for the guy who they purchased it from. And they built this city, fortress on the hill. And it's great because you have a valley all around with mountains around that, about 2 hours broad as you would travel in those days. There's still great agricultural production in the area, so the soils around the area are pretty fertile. But the biggest thing is that defensive position. It's like a donut, if you will, with a hump in the middle. There we go. This is modern day looking down from the satellite at that site. Right here is Samaria, and you can see it's in this big bowl all the way around here of mountainous terrain. So from a defensive standpoint, you're up in a fortress in the middle with almost like a moat. It's not water around it, but you have this area around here, and then you've got this ring of mountains around it. So it becomes one of the most significant cities, in some ways more from an economics and all that sort of thing, never from a religious standpoint, at least from the standpoint of Yahweh. Jerusalem is still the place where his heart is, but this becomes a very important city in the economics and politics of the whole area right here. And these lines outline some of the archaeological finds that they have in the evidence. You can go hunt up other pictures of some of their digs and things and find what's in here. But that's it. That's Samaria.
That's Samaria.
Yeah.
And I thought that, I know that it's in the New Testament because the Samaritans lived there.
Mm-hmm.
But it was there in the Old Testament also?
Omri is the founder of this city and the builder of it. So we'll see him as the guy who started the whole thing, and he bought it. We'll see where he
The
purchased this.
Samaritans are a different kind of person, aren't they? Mixture, blood, or whatever.
It comes out of what happens to the nation of Israel, the northern tribes. And the reason, because this was their capital, and when they are taken away into Assyria and pulled away, they're scattered around, and the ones that remained were considered half-breed Jews. In order, the Jews intermarried with all the conquering nations and all the folks that came into that area when they were taken away by Assyria. And so they were considered not pure Jews. And it's because of that Samaritan, the name stuck from this place here. This became not only the city, but if we go back to that early map you had up there, Kathy.
Which one, this one?
There, yeah, you can see, you got, here's the city, but this whole area was considered Samaria, and you had, if you were a good Jew, you didn't go this way, you went over here, up there, and back across up here, because you did not, that's the hated enemy. That's why the Good Samaritan was such a powerful illustration, because Samaritans were considered the dogs of the earth. You didn't have anything to do with them. That's why the woman's so shocked when at the well, Jesus speaks to her. He says, I'm a Samaritan, you're a Jew, number one, you're a man, I'm a woman, why would you even talk to me? And it all goes back to what we're going to be studying today, right there. So a lot of connections of history into this guy Omri, and a lot of connections internationally around the area. And that's why I was hoping we'd have this website, because there are what they call stels, these stones that record, the kings would record important stuff and stick it up to document their victories or all these sort of things. And the house of Omri is referred to on these, and there's a couple of them. There's one from Moab over here, there's another one further north up there, and there's some from, they're over in Assyria, that refer to the house of Omri. And so there's about 4 different evidences that they have now. One of those also includes the first reference they ever found to the house of David in there. So it's kind of interesting that there's archaeological evidence that supports this reign at this time, connects them with the kings of Assyria and the other nations that are all involved in this story. You can trace it. There's evidence out there. I'll try to have that for you next time so we can look at that. It's also, we're coming right up on passages. While some of this has been maybe less familiar to us, we are right on the doorstep of passages that we've been through before a long time ago in this study. And you all are familiar with names like Elijah and Elisha are just right there. We're going to be rolling into those guys here real soon. And as you go into that, you'll see that the dominant discussion goes from the kings and what they're doing to the prophets. And the focus is going to be on God's prophets and how they're relating to who happens to be king. So it's a really different passage that we'll be going through for some time here. First of all, I'd like to remind you of what happened in the nation. So we've got to kind of back up just a little bit and read through so you will pick up all the insanity that's going on here and going to have that in your mind as we roll ahead. Remember we had in chapter 15 verse 25 we had Nadab, I'll get it right. I can see it, I just can't say it. Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, became king over Israel in the 2nd year of Asa, king of Judah, and he reigned over Israel for 2 whole years. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and he walked in the way of his father, and in his sin which he made inroads sin. And then Baasha, the son of Ahijah of the house of Issachar, conspired against him, and Baasha struck him down at Gibeathon, which belonged to the Philistines, while Nadab and all Israel were laying siege to Gibeathon. So our first military coup has taken place here. He's in there 2 years. This Baasha comes in and cleans house, takes him out, and then he not only takes him out, but he cleans out the whole household, which the prophet had told Jeroboam is going to happen. There won't be anybody left of your family. So that's completed there, as it mentions in verse 29. And then we go to 31. Where am I? We got Baasha goes on down a ways, and he's just kind of a small mention, and yet he was in there for 24 years and walked in the same way of Jeroboam. So at the end of 24 years, he's had a prophecy also saying, in verse 2 of chapter 16, he says, hey, I brought you in here from the dust, which tells us that he came from a nobody. He wasn't royal blood, he wasn't famous. So I brought you up from the dust. In verse 2 of chapter 16, made you leader, and you walked in the way of Jeroboam. Number 1, you provoked me to anger that way. And also he tells him, where is it? My eyeballs went right by it. That it's the problem. I see it. Walked away, Jeroboam, made my people. So I made anger their sins. It's down at the bottom. Oh, verse 7 at the end. It talks about he died and all his household was going to be killed because of the evil which he did in the sight of the Lord, provoking a man anger at the work of his hands, and being like the house of Jeroboam, and because he struck it. And almost all of the scholars that I've checked out, that I have access to, believe that it is the house of Jeroboam. And we talked about a little of that last time, how God says, you know, I told you I was going to replace this guy. I didn't tell you that this is how you were to do it. I'm in charge, and just like David wouldn't touch Saul and his family, it's what God expected. And what he got was a guy that took things into his own hands. He says, you're going to be judged for that. So even when God pronounces judgment on someone, it's not our job to carry it out. And these guys thought it was. So then we have his son, and he's got to be thinking, aha, my son, Elah, the son of Baasha, became king at Tirzah and reigned 2 whole years. And then we have this servant Zimri who comes along, commander of half his chariots. He's a chariot commander, another military man. So we had a military family that took over, ruled for 24 years. His son comes in, and he's got a chariot commander that isn't happy. And an interesting situation is that the rest of the military is back down at Gibeathon fighting with the Philistines again, I believe. Let me get my eye on that one. Yeah, verse 15, the rest of the people were camped against Gibeathon, which belonged to the Philistines. Must have been a perennial problem. They're down fighting Philistines. Where's the king? Back home at a dinner party, drinking party as it turns out, of one of his servants in the house of Arzah. Seems Arzah and Zimri must have known the king pretty well. Knew he wasn't going to be in the military camp. He was going to be at home. Invite him down for a little bit of entertainment and cut his head off while you're at it. Or whatever they did. Took him out, and immediately the conspiracy was such that as soon as word went out, we took out the king. All his minions in the conspiracy immediately executed all the rest of the family. So you had to know that's all been laid, it's all been planned. Bang, it happens quickly. The reason I say quickly is because you remember that Zimri didn't get to celebrate very long, because he reigned 7 days, verse 15, in Tirzah. Because as soon as word got to the military down at Gibeathon that they'd taken out the king and his family, everybody down there made Omri king, who was the commander of the military, and they packed up and they came back and they attacked Tirzah, their own capital city. Put it to the sword, or at least were coming in against it. Had him trapped in there. He goes courageously into the citadel of the king's house in verse 18 and burned the king's house over him with fire, and he died. So 7 days, which kicks off a period of civil war within the nation of Israel. And you go, wait a minute, I didn't read that anywhere, did I? Well, you do. If you read, remember little verse 21, the people of Israel were divided into 2 parts. Half the people followed Tibni, the son of Ginath, to make him king, and the other half followed Omri. So we got this battle going on all these years. So there's 4 years of civil war where they cannot decide. There's no agreement on who's going to be king. And then why am I belaboring all this stuff? Because I want you to realize that during this period of time, there's a young man growing up in the middle of this. And his name is Ahab. He's the son of Omri. He's a military kid, brought up in a military family. He's been living through all this. And his background, his experience in the nation of Israel is not only the worship of the golden calves, but it's in seeing this turmoil, the civil war, the battling, and the power maneuverings, and all this sort of stuff that's going on in the land. This guy Ahab, that you're familiar with the name, you don't always picture him as growing up in this kind of atmosphere, but he's seen the prophecies that God's made. He's watched them be fulfilled. He's seen these guys taken out. He's grown up with this. And in fact, as Omri is being mentioned here, and we see him reigning for those years, it talked about that he reigned 6 years at Tirzah, in which they battled the civil war. And it appears that when that was settled, in verse 24, here it is, and he bought the hill Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver. And he built on the hill and named the city for which he built Samaria, after the name of Shemer, the owner of the hill. So there it is. As he's done that, Ahab's there. As he's done that, Ahab has a wife. And remember, we talked about the outside evidence of Omri and his kingdom. Tells you that he had connections. Have we got one that shows a wider scope of the area at all? It's about the same, a little bit wider. So here's Samaria here, and you start finding out that, okay, over here on this side of the river, there's a king who's got reference to our guy Omri. Omri's been out here, he's been making deals with these folks. He's been making deals with folks up here. There's a power way over here in modern-day Iraq that's beginning to grow called Assyria, and he is already negotiating with them. And he's doing some interesting stuff back and forth over here. And then there's a powerhouse right up here to his north, one that Solomon used in his day. And he's going to decide that he needs an ally up there on that side. And so, if we turn ahead just a little bit, we will find out who that ally is. If you look at verse 31 of chapter 16. And it came about as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. That's Ahab, who Omri, his father, probably used the arranged marriage between his son and that daughter to secure a political and economic link to these guys right up here. The same place that Solomon went to, remember Hiram? This could be down the path away from Hiram, the king up there, Ethbaal. And yes, the name Baal is just like many of the Jewish names reflect, the follower of God or something. Well, that's a similar idea here. So we've got that guy. He goes out there, and along with this political package, he gets a religious package as well, which we'll be seeing for a long, long time in Israel. That's the tail end, the last little phrase there. And went to serve Baal, however you pronounce that, and worshipped him. So all of this has roots in Omri's reign and the politics and the economics and everything of real life. It's not, yes, we see the religious side and the bringing in the gods and that, because that's what the writer wanted us to focus on. But what I want you to see is that happened in the context of real life, of real nations, real exchanges, real battles, real tug-of-war and negotiations and trading back and forth. And they use this marriage thing, and that brings in Jezebel. And that has roots that go all the way to Jerusalem. Why would I say that? Because Ahab and Jezebel have a daughter. And in just a little while, you're going to see a new king, who we normally think of as a really great king, take over right here in Jerusalem. And this man, Jehoshaphat, is going to do wonderful, good things down there. He is going to be considered and looked at as one of the righteous kings of the area. But one little political weakness that Jehoshaphat has is that he makes himself an ally. There he is right there. You see who's king while he's king? And we're going to see really interesting relationship right here. And where are we here? Right down there is a little name in parentheses. Does anybody know who that is and why it's in parentheses? For one, this isn't a man's name, it's a woman's name. This is the woman who was married to this son, right there. Because he wanted to secure a political alliance with Ahab. So what would you do? The same thing Ahab did. Take Jezebel's daughter, marry him to your son, secure a political relationship, and there she is, right there. And she killed every one of her sons and grandsons except that. Isn't that amazing? These things way up here, as you're seeing, look, here we are, these guys right here, all this stuff has tentacles that go all the way down. Stuff doesn't happen in isolation. And so here we are getting along, and I haven't even got to anything spiritual yet. We're still wading through all this political stuff. Isn't it fascinating? Isn't it a big deal, right? What I want you to realize is our lives look just like this. What's that thing they talk about, the connectivity? If you go so many degrees of, you go out, you're 6 points of, and amazing the circle of connections that are there. And I think some of it they're looking at family, marriage connections, but you look at just contacts, same sort of thing, and look at where the connections, the fibers of your life, and how you live and the choices you make. How many people and how far down the road do those choices fall and what do they affect? It's huge. It affects history in the nation for years and years and years and years. It affects the course of nations by decisions that are made right here by this guy. So Omri's, while his mention in Kings is very small, his impact on the nation is huge. And even now in the nation of Israel, as the archaeologists are digging around and everything, there are a lot of Jewish people in Israel who are Jewish by birth, but not Jewish by faith. And for years, Omri is usually looked at in Christian circles and in devout Jewish circles as an evil king. And he was. His religious side, he was as bad as it gets, you know. And Ahab just took it one notch higher, bringing in all the Baals and everything. Omri set that up. But the nation of Israel, as they look at the archaeology and the evidence out there, have now said Omri's almost a greater influence as king than David and Solomon. And a lot of archaeologists and a lot of those guys over there now that are not saved individuals, but they're looking at strictly from an evidence, they're starting to say, we're not so sure that they didn't have an even greater building program, an even greater impact economically in the nation than David and Solomon. And, you know, you can argue about that. But they basically say, well, David had, this little bitty encampment down in Jerusalem compared to this massive impact of Omri. Well, the nation has grown and the whole nation's impact is great. They're saying that Samaria in a lot of ways was a bigger, more sophisticated city than Jerusalem, and that the impact of Omri and his international connections started a progression of influence in the area.
Which the Bible calls marrying into the wrong family.
Yeah, and you marry right into the world family. So from a spiritual standpoint, I mean, they forgot that they were God's chosen people. They were another nation with all the politics and all the stuff going on. And so from the world's viewpoint says, man, this was a successful reign you see here, and it continued on. And the influence that it had for years to come in directing traffic within the nation right up until Assyria finally gained enough power to come in there and clean house and take them out. And so they look at it and say, wow, this is a great empire that they had. But those tentacles are huge. and they affect these guys. These guys down here are major effect by the whole thing. And some people would argue, and I think in a way you can argue that's right, this puts Omri it's influencing in the line of Christ, because that woman was one of the king's wives, and it was her grandson that was the king, that was the little boy that's made king. We'll see him later. So, boy, what a crazy crooked web we weave. So the choices we make and the decisions we make are important beyond us. And it's hard to remember that. When we're in the midst of a decision and how we're going to run our lives, what choices we're going to make, we say, maybe ruin is the right word. If I want to ruin my life and make that choice, then that's mine, that's the American way, right? I can do what I want to do, and I can do whatever's right in my own eyes, and it has no impact on anybody else, and it's a lie. Because all of us have impact on others somewhere, somehow, either for good or for evil. And even though you think you threw that hammer out in the middle of the field and no one else was around to see it, it has trickle-down effects. It'll catch up with you someday. When your son finds that hammer out there and says, "Why is that out there?" So, what a mess we've got here. We've got Ahab coming onto the throne, and we're going to pick up next time. I'll let you out a little bit early today. But we just want to close with where am I going to pick it up? Let's just pick it up in verse 29, because I want you to see what happened again, and we'll read through the end of chapter 15 there. And it came about as soon as he was king, this Baasha struck down the household of Jeroboam, did not leave to Jeroboam any persons alive until he had destroyed them, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servant Ahijah the Shilonite. And because of the sins of Jeroboam which he sinned, in which he made Israel sin, because of the provocation which he provoked the Lord God of Israel to anger. Now the rest of the acts of Nadab and all he did are they written in the book of the Chronicles of King of Israel. And there was war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, all their days. In the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, Baasha the son of Ahijah became king. And he reigned 24 years and did evil. He walked in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of Jeroboam and the sin which he made Israel to sin. Boy, that's getting old. And the word of the Lord came to Jehu, the son of Hanani, against Baasha, saying, and by the way, we'll see Jehu again, not only in the northern kingdom, but in the southern. Inasmuch as I exalted you from the dust and made you leader over my people Israel, and you have walked in the way of Jeroboam and made my people Israel sin, provoking me to anger with their sins, behold, I will consume Baasha and his house, and make your house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. And the curse, anyone who dies in the city, the dogs shall eat, anyone who dies in the field, the birds of the heavens will eat. And he rested with the kings, and I'll bounce over that. And in the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, Elah became king, and he died in 2 years, speeding through it, sorry about that. Zimri in verse 12 destroyed all the household of Baasha according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke against Baasha through Jehu the prophet. You'd think they'd catch on after a while, wouldn't you? When Jehu speaks, you should listen. In verse 15, in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, Zimri reigned 7 days at Tirzah. And then Omri and all Israel, in verse 17, went up to Gibeathon and besieged Tirzah, and Zimri burned himself, in verse 18. And Jeroboam, he died of the sins which he sinned, doing evil, verse 19, in the sight of the Lord, walking in the way of Jeroboam. Boy, that has deep roots. And his sin which he did, making Israel sin. And the rest of acts of Zimri and his conspiracy, they're written down and lost. And the people of Israel were divided. My gosh, civil war. Tibni and Ginath, the other half followed Omri. Omri prevailed over the people who followed Tibni, the son of Ginath, and Tibni died. We don't know how. And Omri became king. And Omri did evil, in verse 25, in the sight of the Lord, and acted more wickedly than all who were before him. his spiritual legacy. And he walked in all the way of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and all his sins which he made Israel sin, provoking the Lord God of Israel with their idols. And Omri slept with his fathers, and was buried in Samaria, and Ahab his son became king in his place. And that's where we're going to pick it up next time with Ahab. What a chaotic introduction to this guy Ahab. He's going to be there for a long time. 22 years, I think it was. Yeah, reigned over Israel. Oh, Omri was 22. I'm sorry. And Ahab's going to crank it up another notch and be a major influence. So it's like God's setting this whole thing up. It's pretty interesting to watch and see how God's bringing things to a head. And if you will watch now as you go into Elijah, it's like God has allowed things to get to the point where it's very black and white. There's gray out there. There's always gray areas that are difficult decisions to make, but He's allowed it to get bad enough that now it's Elijah and it's the prophets of Baal, and you've got choices to make that are pretty clear. And He's going to challenge people with where their faith is. And so you can just see God allowing things to get the way they are. So if you look around you today and you say, oh boy, things are terrible, where's God? I can tell you He's right here. He's always here. And He's carrying out His plan. And whatever's happening around us, good or bad, is part of His design and part of His plan. And the question is, how are we going to relate to and how will we react to the things that we see? Are we going to put this as our guiding principle for life and apply this to everything we see and do around us? Or are we going to take what's around us and find some way to shoehorn this in so it's comfortable? Because that's what we'll see in the nation of Israel. Finding ways to take what's around them and what they wanted and make it fit with what's here. So that's our challenge this morning, to look at ourselves and say, which way are we? And we'll pick up with Ahab and Elijah and some of the amazing things that God tries to tell His people next time. Father, we thank You for our time together this morning. Kind of a rambling look through Your Old Testament as we look at the history that's recorded here, the brief little snippets and snapshots of a nation that in great turmoil, slowly coming out of the turmoil politically and settling down to some steady leadership, and yet at the same time some very evil leadership from the standpoint of following their God, that are reaching the point of no return, where they've totally lost their faith in You and have not been able to see, because of the probably economic and political success that they've been having, that they owe everything they have to You, and that their eternal security is tied up in the promise that's in the law and in the temple in Jerusalem. Father, help us to be able to avoid the pit that they have fallen into, of allowing the world to lead us and the attractions of all that's around us and the success to lead us away from You. But to remember that You have a calling and a plan for our lives, that Your Son paid the price for us. We're bought with a price and we're not our own. Father, help us to remember that. Help us to keep our focus upon You and to orient our lives in this world to be a witness and testimony to Your grace and Your love. We thank You in Jesus' name.